so in this part, I want to talk about some workplace competencies. Workplace competencies. So when I say competency, I mean any set of behaviors that are that increase how you are perceived in the workplace, right? So we're talking about emotional intelligence. So not necessarily like your skills, like how you do your job, like how well you run the machine at your factory or something. It's not that. What I'm talking about is how you handle the emotional intelligence parts of your job and the things that you can do to make yourself be perceived more welcomingly, right? You know, so when you're on the workplace, we've all probably been around people that maybe they could do the job well, but nobody liked them, right? Or you know, they were hard to get along with, or that kind of stuff. And so so there's a difference between the technical skill of a job and somebody's emotional intelligence, right? And all the studies show that emotional intelligence is a much greater predictor of success than academic intelligence. Because when it comes down to it, if somebody's going to promote somebody and they're going to have to work with you all the time, all things being equal, they're going to choose somebody that they like, right? Unless there's a major reason to choose somebody else, most of the time they're going to choose the person that they like because they have to work with them all the time. And so promotion, I mean, they're not in your head. They don't know exactly what facts you know more than the other person. They don't know if you read a couple more books than somebody else did. They don't really know that just by dealing with you on a day-to-day basis. But what they do know is whether they like you or not, right? And believe it or not, most promotions have an element of that in it. You know, I mean, they may try and seem you know, objective, and they're just trying to promote the right person. But in their head, the right person is almost always the one they like, right? Because I mean, that's part of being the right person, is that people need to like you, right? And so emotional intelligence is a much greater predictor of workplace success, right? So some people can get to high places by just walking all over people, but most of the time, that's a rarity. Most of the time, people excel because they have a way of getting along with people. All right. So I want to talk about kind of the three kind of areas here. So there's emotional intelligence. And then some literature will break this up into another section called social intelligence, right? And then you have technical skill, academics. And so in these three areas, often, and I don't know how it is now, I guess they could have made some changes, but by and large, in K through 12, the focus is more over here than it is on just strictly developing someone's emotional intelligence. It doesn't mean they don't do it at all, but if you look at the curriculum, it is much heavier on the skill-based side than it is on the emotional development side and relational skills sections. And so, however, there is some research that I was reading where they took some sample schools and they put them through a different program, particularly the elementary age when they're still forming this stuff, and they made the curriculum all about this with only a little bit of this. And what they found, the obvious thing that you would expect is that the way the students get along with each other would increase, right? Obviously, so if you're teaching them emotional skills, how to deal with people, how to control themselves a little bit more, you know, how to engage others in conversation and how to listen. They did things like that. And so it obviously increased the students' ability to get along. Then the other thing that was kind of obvious is it limited the number of what they called negative behaviors, things like biting, spitting, fighting, you know, that kind of stuff. All the quantifiable negative behaviors, all that stuff was limited. The thing that they didn't necessarily expect that was a result was that their academic grades all went through the roof when they focused on this instead of this, because the emotional stability that it gave them caused them to do better with study habits, caused them to be more reflective in their thinking, that kind of stuff. And so kind of a side benefit of teaching emotional intelligence is that it results in somebody that's able to excel better on the academic side, because there are certain elements of personal self-control, personal confidence that come from this that have a major impact on how students do here. We've talked about studies where they will give a teacher a particular class filled with all honors students, and at the end of the year, the honors students, as expected, all had straight A's. One of the highest graded aggregate of the entire school was the honors class, which you would expect. But then at the end of the class, they tell the teacher those were just randomly selected students. They had nothing to do with honors programs, which means that the way that the teacher interacted with them and the self-confidence that the teacher put into them because of who he thought they were changed their ability. So it wasn't so much that they either had the skill or they didn't. It was that there has to be a way to unlock it, which deals more with this than it does just teaching them the facts. That if they lack this, then they won't be able to pick this up as quickly. And it's not because they couldn't, it's because no one ever poured into them the emotional skills that allow you to be successful in your study habits. Because you without self-control, without self-confidence, you will limit yourself, right? And so many students have poor grades because they don't have the internal strength to do what God gave them the ability to do, right? And so it's not so much a question of talent or ability, it's more a question of how do they see themselves often, and how do others see them. And if you put them in an environment where people see them really good, that might have been part of my life, to be honest. From the very beginning, they had me take a test, and I scored really high on the test. So they put me in this private group of kids where there was 5 of us. And they always told us all the time, oh, you guys are really smart, And so my whole life I grew up just assuming that. And so I tried a lot harder. Yeah, And so I think that might have been part of it. I think God gifted me with the ability to do some of this stuff. But I think if I hadn't been in an environment where somebody was constantly telling me, hey, you can do really good, who knows where I would have been, And it makes you wonder if other people had people pouring them into that way and saying, oh, you've got the ability to do anything you want, you just need to apply yourself, what types of development that they would have had. And so one of the biggest things that's lacking in the school system and in parenting is this component of teaching people self-confidence and relational skills. All right. And so out of this, I've got 3 things that I wrote down that I think are important components. So whenever I use EQ, I just mean emotional intelligence, as opposed to IQ, which is academic intelligence. So the first one is intent. Now, the reason that I'd break this up into these 3 is because sometimes when people want to learn relational skills, when they want to learn to be more emotionally stable or things like that, they will often go to this one, to behavior, and try and say, okay, what do I need to change that I'm doing so that I can be more emotionally stable and be more emotionally intelligent, or whatever, however you want to say that. And they often go to the behavior thing as if I just change what I do, then it will be sufficient. But the truth is that emotional intelligence has really 3 components to it. And the other 2 are often more important than this, because if you change your behavior without changing these 2, then it's not as genuine and it's not as sustainable, right? So, it's like if somebody hates somebody else and they tell themselves, well, at least when they get in, I'll smile and offer them a seat, right? but you're going to have a hard time really keeping up your feelings for that person because you didn't change anything on the inside. You're just putting on a show because you think it's the right thing to do. I'll shake their hand, I'll smile, I'll offer them a seat, but nothing's changed on the inside, which means, say if they said something back to you during the dinner, you'd probably blow up on them because on the inside you're still really mad at them, right? And so, so changing behavior alone is only one piece of the puzzle. And so one of the more important things for emotional intelligence is self-perception. How you see yourself is an important aspect. If you have confidence in your own self-awareness, right, that creates the momentum that you can change yourself from the inside. The more you're aware of your internal workings, if you will, more self-aware is what they call it, then the greater confidence you have that you can make positive changes. But somebody that's not aware will have a hard time changing things. It's like when you minister to people, if they can't label what sin they have, they can't label their problem, they're going to have a hard time fixing it, right? So if you're doing marriage counseling, you're doing counseling with anybody, you got to be able to put a label on what their problem is. Because until you label it, it's just this emotional feeling. It's they'll define it by the problem, they'll define it by the consequences, they'll define it by the pain that they felt from it, and they'll be all around it. But the problem is you lied to her. You know what I'm saying? And so you got the consequences of her being mad at you. And so in the counseling session, they'll say, well, she's always yelling at me. But that's a consequence. The problem is he lied to her. Or, he say, well, she's just not a very trusting person. Well, that's a consequence because he lied to her. You know what I'm saying? So people, when they tell you, when they self-report, they're often misguided if they're not self-aware. So if you can help them put a label on what they're dealing with, well, you haven't been telling the truth much. Then all of a sudden, they can focus in on the problem because they will spend their whole life trying to fix the consequences and never deal with the thing because it's never been labeled. And so all they're doing is experiencing the world as it comes at them of, man, she's mad at me all the time. And so their focus is on what they don't like in the relationship without an awareness of what it is that they're doing. And so when you can help them put a label on it, then they can deal with it more easily. Because until they put a label on it, sometimes they don't even know. Paul says in the Bible, he says, until God said something about coveting, I don't know I would have even known what coveting was. But now that God put it in there, he says, I find myself wanting to covet all the time. Because you have a label on it, and you're able, in many ways that was the purpose of the law, was to put a label on what was already there. So these people, Cain killed Abel. It's not like the law was the introduction of these things. The law was the labeling of these things so that we could deal with it and have a greater awareness of it. So same thing if somebody's going to improve themselves, quite a bit of it deals with self-perception, how you see yourself. If you can see yourself more clearly, then it becomes much easier for you to deal with real changes as opposed to the things around you that you're experiencing that even if you change them, doesn't change your future because you keep bringing your problem with you into the next situation, right? And so a lot of people live their life changing situation after situation after situation because they've never identified in themselves what is creating the disorder around them. And so self-perception is important. And then the other thing is intent. If you have no intent of being an understanding person, then all this other stuff is just going to be window dressing and it's not going to really matter. There has to be an internal intent that drives the rest of this. So you have an internal intent. You have to want to be a loving person. You have to want to be an honest person. So there may be some people, a lot of these people you think of Enron and some of that type of stuff, they had no intent of being honest, right? And so no matter what they did to hide their behaviors and stuff, it still kept coming back to greed and all these things because the intent was wrong. And so no matter what somebody does to change their behavior, until they change their intent, it doesn't work from the outside in necessarily. Like you can change a lot of things from the outside in, but ultimately there's got to be a change here Otherwise, nothing else really matters, right? And so these three elements are important. So to take an example in the workplace, you have to want to be understanding of your fellow employees, right? Because if you don't really at your core want to, then you're going to have a hard time genuinely doing it in reality, right? And so you may do occasional things just to get what you want. That's where manipulation comes in. If somebody has the intent of greed, they may take on the behavior of understanding, but it's only because they want to fulfill their intent. So they are understanding with you because they're listening for how can I get your money, right? And so the intent is wrong, and so they may have the right behavior, which is listening and understanding, but the motive doesn't result in emotional intelligence because the intent is wrong. So there's got to be the proper intent to start with, that I want to be engaging with people. I want to be friendly. I want to be a welcoming person. I want to be somebody that adds something to the workplace. I want to be somebody that if I leave, people notice it because I was adding more than what I needed to. I was helping them. I want people to feel comfortable around me. I want people to feel like they could tell me something and it's safe. I want people to feel that when we're having conversations, that they're really heard and that I'm not just listening for the next thing that I can say, but that I genuinely want to hear them. And people have a way of picking up on that. We all recognize people that when you're talking with them, you have that feeling that they're not really hearing you, that they're just thinking of the next thing that they want to say, and so they cut you off sometimes and little things and you begin to realize, I can't make a connection with this person because all they're doing is talking about themselves or whatever. And so the intent in that person is they want to be heard. And so that affects their self-perception and that affects their behavior. And so the key to the beginning of developing more emotional intelligence is to deal with your intents and to begin to identify what are the intents that should be on the inside of me that I can then use as a foundation for changing behavior. Because when you really change an intent on the inside, the behaviors become much easier. They're much more natural. You know, if you really genuinely want to be a welcoming person, then little by little you'll develop the behavior much easier than somebody who doesn't want to be welcoming, who's just trying to put on a show. Jesus called it hypocrites, right? You know, because they were the actors of his day. All right, so these are kind of the three areas. Emotional intelligence, by this definition, when you divide it this way, deals more with your personal understanding of yourself, self-control, self-awareness. This deals with your ability to connect with others, right? How you hear them, how you express empathy, how you express sympathy. And then technical skills deals with what you know how to do. And so we're almost out of time, but we'll pick this up next week too. But what I want us to talk about soon, and I may not get to it today, is that these tend to be threshold skills, right? That this is the bare minimum to get the job, right? You need to know how to do whatever it is that they're asking you to do. So like if it's teaching, I mean, you got to have, that's why they want a teaching degree, is so that at least they know this part is covered. That's the minimum of getting the job. What separates you in the workplace from other people are these things, right? And what they found is that with very few exceptions, having more of this does not necessarily separate you more, right? So if you've got a teacher that's read 200 books and a teacher that's read 1,000 books, how they are perceived in the break room is not determined by that as much as it is by these two, right? When the boss looks down on who they want to promote to some kind of an advisory role or something like that, they're not saying, okay, which one knows the technical side of this more, unless it's glaring, unless the person doesn't meet the threshold. But as long as they both meet the threshold, they're not determining the decisions based on that. They're evaluating people based on this, right? So you got two people in the room, and you're trying to figure out who you want to work with. If they both have the same degree and they both have the general awareness of the job, then your decision comes down to these, right? And so what will separate you in the workplace is not pouring more into this, although you need to have this. It's by understanding how this can separate you from everyone else that already has this, right? And so as you begin to be more emotionally aware, be able to be more engaging with people, be able to have more of a connection with people, understanding empathy and sympathy and all of the these, then you begin to separate yourself in the mind of the people around you, right? And so they won't, when they talk about people, they don't say, "Oh man, did you see the article he read last week?" You know what they say is, "Did you see how they're always welcoming?" You know, they notice that they notice things like you go above and beyond, or they notice things like you helped them with something that was their project and didn't benefit you at all, but you came over and helped because you wanted to be friendly, or they notice that you're always the one that smiles and welcomes people and makes everyone feel at peace when they show up into the room, because that's an important skill. If everybody's coming into the room, if you can be the one that makes everybody feel comfortable and calls them by name and gives them a hug and says, "Oh, here, sit with me," you know, that type of stuff, that's something that people remember more, and they will define you in their mind by how well you do this, right? Because most of the time, everybody in the room has this, right? I mean, if you're in a job and they hired you, almost everybody in the room has this to a certain degree or another. This separates you in their mind. This is what causes you to be promoted. This is what causes you to be the one that people think about in a good light. Because you could have all of this, and if you're awkward and you don't want to talk with people and you always isolate yourself, then you'll be bitter on the inside because you're thinking, I can do this as good as anybody else. They never give me a chance. And they'll blame it on people around them. That you'll hear that all the time. Well, they never gave me a chance. I can do this as good as everybody else. They just don't like me here. Well, that's probably true. Maybe they don't like you because you haven't developed these, you know. And so, so this is important. And developing your ability to connect with people. Now, anybody know the difference between sympathy and empathy? Because there is a difference. Empathy is listening to understand, right? And sometimes people get these as if they're the same. Sympathy is more like you have compassion on someone, right? You have sympathy for them. So you're connecting with them on an emotional level because something is wrong, right? And so you have sympathy. You are helping them through a tough time. Empathy can also help someone through a tough time, but it's not limited to that. Empathy is the ability to listen with understanding. Which applies to positive things as much as it does to negative things, right? So somebody doesn't have to have a crisis for you to be able to engage them and listen to them and connect with them in their conversation. You know, and it really is true. You've probably heard this a million times, but if you want to connect with people, it's about letting them talk. You know, especially if it's somebody new that you haven't met yet very much. Like I went out to lunch with somebody last week, and I just let them talk for almost the whole time. And then after that, they felt very comfortable with me, you know, but I didn't even know them. I'd seen them once or twice, but I didn't know them before that. And so they shared all these things from their life and all this kind of stuff. And once somebody feels heard, then all of a sudden they trust you because you're not just somebody, you're somebody that knows my story. And so it's very important, particularly if you're a natural talker, right? To learn to sit back and ask them questions about themselves first. Doesn't mean you can't talk, but the way to be, it's a very simple tactic, but the way to be an engaging person is just to be the first one to ask a question about the other person. It's as simple as that. That will handle about 80% of your things with dealing with people. Is if you have a conversation with somebody, if you're the first one to say, so tell me about what you do with this, right? And you let them share their heart and that kind of stuff, they will come away thinking like, man, I know them so well. And they don't know anything about you. But what they mean by that is you know them, right? And so what people are really wanting is to be heard. And everybody has that desire to be heard. And so that's a very practical thing that anybody can do. And if you do that, to be the first one to ask them about themselves and to keep putting the conversation back on them, you develop a level of trust. And they won't even know why. They're not going to say, well, he asked me 8 questions about myself to my 2 questions about him, and so that balance results in me appreciating him more. They won't be able to articulate it, but they'll say, like, man, I had a good time talking with them. I felt like I could really connect with them because you gave them the opportunity to empty themselves towards you, right? And so that's important. They will come away thinking that they trust you, because anybody that's heard your story, you have more of a trust. And so the way to get people around you to trust you more is to ask them about them, because we trust people that we feel know who we are, right? That's why if it's a family member, and unless they have a really bad track record with you, if it's a family member and they come over and say, hey, can I borrow your weed whacker, you don't feel like you're never going to get it back because you know them, right? Because there's a connection. So the knowing produces a trust. And it's the same thing in other workplace environments, that the more someone feels like they are known, the more they naturally trust. And you only promote people that you trust, right? And so in the workplace, it's important not just to be promoted, right? Because then your intent is wrong and you'll still struggle. So the intent has to be, I genuinely want to connect with people. I genuinely want people to feel at ease around me. And when that's the intent, then you can use your skills of listening and empathy so that as they're talking, if you have no intention of being the star of the show, and you genuinely have that intent, I don't need to be the star of this conversation, I'll let them do that, and they begin to talk, and they begin to pour it out, then all of a sudden your mind is free to do a really amazing thing. Understanding. Because when you're trying to think about how you can contribute to the conversation and what you can do to make sure that you're carrying your weight in the conversation, then there's not enough of your brain left to genuinely hear them in a deepest way, right? And so when they're doing the talking, it's really important for you to have, and this is the skill of empathy, is that while they're talking, you are busy understanding, not preparing to talk, right? You can't do the two. It's very hard to do the two well at the same time, right? So, I mean, sometimes if the conversation warrants it, there needs to be back and forth. I mean, sometimes, you know, if you just sit there and don't say anything, and they're trying to ask you, you know, how do you fix the printer, it's not going to work. But if you're trying to engage them in some types of, you know, getting to know them, that kind of stuff, this is huge. To listen with understanding breaks down all the walls, breaks down all the barriers, and it enables you to genuinely understand where that person's coming from. And there's something below the surface that happens when you deal with people like this that enables them to see you in a different light. You didn't change at all. All you did was give them an opportunity to pour themselves at you. And all of a sudden, their perception of you has changed when you didn't really do anything. I mean, you're not any different than you were the day before. You're still the same person. But how they see you and how they will treat you and approach you from here on out is different after they've been heard. Right? So that's an important workplace tip. All right. So we've got a whole bunch of other things. What we'll do next week is I'm going to give you the specific competencies that make up this. So, I mean, there's certain things that you should be doing that contribute to this, right? So I'll give you about 4 or 5 things to start you with that in each of these sections are actual things that you should create an intent about, right? That if I give you these 5, that you should then create an intent that these 5 are going to be part of what I want to do so that I can begin to develop more here, right? That is important, right? Okay, let's pray. Lord, thank you for this class and for the things that you're doing in our life, Lord. And I pray you continue to stretch us and fill us and help us to be able to connect with people on a deeper level and to be a trustworthy person. It's somebody that people have peace about when they're around. And Lord, we thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.